Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. And this is for our class for Wednesday, April 9th. And what we are talking about is Richard II and also getting ready for our next play, which happens to be Macbeth. So, in terms of Richard II, if you'll notice in the notes below, I've indicated some of the history for you. As you know, Shakespeare used the Chronicles of Holinshed, which was considered the historical document of the time, in order to be able to dramatize those events for his history plays. So he didn't follow the history completely, but to give you an idea, this all begins with King Edward III. And Edward III ruled in 1312 to 1377. And he was the father of several sons, and some of them are featured in Richard II. The first, he's the father of Lionel, who was the Duke of Clarence, Edward, who's the Black Prince, John of Gaunt. That name probably sounds familiar because John of Gaunt was a major character in Richard II. John of Gaunt is also the Duke of Lancaster. Edmund of Langley, who is the Duke of York, and that too should sound familiar from Richard II. Thomas of Woodstock, who was the Duke of Gloucester. And of course, this is how our play begins with Gloucester's assassination and the question of who might have been responsible for Gloucester's assassination. Now, one of the reasons why the history plays are notoriously complex is that multiple names will be used to reference one character. So sometimes that character will be known by their first name. Sometimes that character will be known by their last name. Sometimes that character will be known by their title. And all of these are interchangeable. So sometimes keeping charts of the names can be helpful in terms of being able to separate out the characters. But as many characters as there are in this play, our two major players happen to be Richard and Bolingbroke. Now, going back to the history, which is in the first section of the notes below, Edward the Black Prince, he was the father of Richard II, who is our main character in this play. John of Gaunt, who's also the Duke of Lancaster, is Henry Bolingbroke's father. And Henry Bolingbroke is also the Duke of Hereford, and eventually, when he becomes king, he becomes Henry IV. Edmund Langley is the Duke of York, and he's the father of Aumerle, the Earl of Rutland. So in terms of Richard and Bolingbroke, some questions to keep in mind that we talked a little bit about last class is that there are suspicions throughout the entire play. And one of the suspicions are reference Richard himself. And could he be guilty in Gloucester's murder? In other words, was he working with Mowbray? Another suspicion is that Bolingbroke is not completely innocent and that he has been vying for the throne since the very beginning of the play. So how much can we trust Bolingbroke? Now, Richard has made multiple errors, and one of the things we talked about is that this play is the tragedy of Richard II, and one of the things that you can expect from a tragic hero is that they have flaws in character. Richard has quite a few, and in terms of some of the errors that Richard makes, when Gaunt, who is Bolingbroke's father, on his deathbed, and one assumes that when you're on your deathbed, you're going to be telling the truth, warns Richard against poor rule. Richard completely ignores that and instead steals Bolingbroke's inheritance. Also, Richard leaves the country after that, and he goes to fight off in Irish wars and entrusts York with the kingdom. And we know that ultimately what we will see is a transformation of York over the course of the play, where he first is loyal to Richard as one should be, because the king is the God anointed. So basically, the human equivalent of God on earth. And then York moves to being neuter, or what he says, neutral, in terms of not wanting to take a position between Richard and Bolingbroke, because obviously Richard has made some egregious errors, and Bolingbroke has obviously been wronged. And then finally, York moves to the position where he's going to support Bolingbroke. And York's son, Aumerle, is not going to follow that position, which is how we see families are torn apart because of their political alliances. So the consequences, and there are quite a few. This is in the fourth section, the notes below. Bolingbroke breaks his exile with an army to, quote, get his inheritance, unquote. As I had discussed last class, it seems a bit suspicious that he shows up with an army. So one could come to the conclusion that he's using this as an excuse to ultimately overtake Richard and to overthrow Richard. Richard, after multiple tantrums, this is where we see Richard at his worst. He does not have the qualities necessary to be a leader. And one of the things we see about Richard is that he really has the temperament of a poet rather than a politician. Some beautiful poetry in this play, but again, not going to serve him well in terms of leadership. Richard, after multiple tantrums, many of them public, relinquishes his throne to Bolingbroke, either because Richard is filled with self-pity and weakness, or because Richard understands that he basically has lost, and the only thing he can do is concede. Factions begin to form. So they're factions for Richard. One of the leaders of those factions happened to be Aumerle, even though his father, York, is supporting Bolingbroke. And Bolingbroke's major leader for his faction, who becomes ultimately Henry IV when Bolingbroke takes over power and becomes king, York. So father and son are pitted against one another in terms of their political alliances. And Bolingbroke, who's now king, King Henry, imprisons Richard and executes the traitors and pardons Aumerle, York's son. And there could be good reasons for doing this, or there could be bad reasons for doing this, or a combination of the two, as we talked about last class. Richard is publicly humiliated, which would be huge during the time because, again, Richard was the God anointed. We see throughout the entire course of the play that Richard talks a lot, but he doesn't act. And when he finally does act at the ending of the play, too little, too late. Exton assassinates Richard in prison. Of course, it could be that Exton decides to do this on his own, or it could be that Bolingbroke is just such a master manipulator that he realized that if he had stated out loud that it would be better if Richard was no longer with them, that someone would take that as a cue to commit an execution or an assassination, I should say. And ultimately, Henry IV, aka Bolingbroke, could claim innocence because he didn't dirty his hands. I use the term deliberately because when we get to Macbeth, we're going to be talking about out damn spot and one's dirty hands. And the ending of the play is with Bolingbroke, who's now King Henry, saying he's upset. Of course, this could all be an act, or he could truly be upset, and taking a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It could be because he realizes that he has guilt, or it could be basically a play to try to gain sympathy from the populace, or a combination of the two. But he knows he's going to have an uneasy role. Now, one of the things that I've talked about in terms of Richard is that it's got incredibly powerful quotes. And I've listed just a few of these in the fifth section below. Act 1, Scene 1, line 178. This is where Mowbray is talking about the importance of reputation. Notice this is a theme that Shakespeare has followed in other plays. For instance, Much Ado About Nothing was so important in terms of reputation. Act 1, Scene 3, line 236. This is Gaunt talking about how he's torn between being a father and wanting to support his son, but also being a judge and a politician. And those two roles basically contradict one another in this instance. Gaunt, Act 2, Scene 1, line 31, his deathbed speech, one of the more famous speeches in Shakespearean drama, where he talks about, amongst other things, the disease that's corrupting the land. And that's Act 2, Scene 1, line 93. York talks about the importance of trying to be patient, even though he realizes that sins have been committed. And this is in Act 2, Scene 1, line 163. We see how his loyalty is tested and torn in Act 2, Scene 2, line 111. And then finally, he resolves to be neutral in Act 2, Scene 3, line 152. Richard, with many of his public speeches of lament, shows his weakness as a ruler. Act 3, Scene 2, line 47. Remember, we had talked about the pyramid structure of a Shakespearean drama, that the first two acts basically build tension, and then the top of the pyramid is Act 3, and that's the height of action, and then we've got a descent. So it's not surprising that this is where we're going to see the transfer of power in Act 3 between Richard and Bolingbroke. We see Richard vacillate. One of the many problems Richard has is that he can't make a decision and he can't stick with it. He keeps going back and forth. Act 3, Scene 2, line 83, where we see how sometimes he basically says that he will be brave, and then other times he says that all is lost. He even compares himself to Jesus being betrayed by Judas, which of course shows Richard's arrogance and hubris, but also again illustrates the idea of how the king would be viewed as God anointed on earth. That's Act 3, Scene 2, line 129. One of the many speeches of self-pity, Act 3, Scene 2, line 144. And we see how ultimately York makes a decision to join Bolingbroke, Act 3, Scene 2, line 200, and ultimately support Bolingbroke. Richard has to submit. It's a wonderful scene where he says he's going to give up the crown, and then, of course, he tries not to give up the crown. And this is an Act 3, Scene 3, line 143. The garden scene, as I was mentioning before, that gives us a sense of the outdoors and greenery in a very dark and claustrophobic kind of play. Act 3, Scene 4, line 29, when the gardeners are basically showing more insight than Richard himself. And then Richard's loss of crown, Act 4, Scene 1, line 162, and that uneasy transfer of power that occurs, Act 4, Scene 1, line 200. Richard is publicly humiliated. It's something that Bolingbroke stops, either because Bolingbroke is showing empathy or because Bolingbroke already understands that his position is tenuous at best, and the last thing he wants to do is to make Richard into a martyr. And Richard's public humiliation, Act 4, Scene 1, line 276. If Richard shows any kind of empathy, it's when he consoles the queen. And this is where we see a more human side to Richard. And this is Act 5, Scene 1, line 16. This is one of the ways that Shakespeare has changed the history around to suit his dramatic purposes, because historically Richard II had married a child bride in order to unify two different kingdoms. But here we have an adult bride, so we get to see a more mature relationship between Richard and his wife. Richard, again, with his self-pity, talks about how ultimately he's going to be the subject of sad tales told about him. Act 5, Scene 1, line 37. You know that Shakespeare loves to use metadrama, where he's making reference to the idea that what we're seeing is a play. We see that with York in Act 5, Scene 2, line 23. And then, of course, Bolingbroke, who's now King Henry, pardons Aumerle, Act 5, Scene 3, line 131, which could be an act of generosity, or it could be a politically motivated move, so that Aumerle will be indebted to Henry, and Henry can call that debt in the future. Richard, and this is the first time Richard is alone. He basically has been performing throughout the entire play as king. But finally he's alone. Act 5, Scene 5, line 1. And perhaps there's a little bit of reflection, and regret. Notice how I qualify that with the perhaps. Of course, Richard also talks about his jealousy, about how Bolingbroke has basically usurped his position. Act 5, Scene 5, line 84. And then finally, the pilgrimage that Bolingbroke decides to take as the new king, as Henry IV. Act 5, Scene 6, line 34. And this is actually going to be today's attendance question, where I'm going to ask you to either identify one of the scenes that I've just reviewed and indicate why you think it's important, or another scene that perhaps I didn't highlight that you think is equally or even more important. As we get ready to transition to tragedies, now obviously the tragedies are going to be, well, for lack of a better word, tragic. Hence, they are tragedies. And Richard II can definitely be seen as tragic, but Richard II is also based on British history. And if we were to continue to read on with the saga of Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, ending with Henry V, Henry V is not necessarily a tragic play. When we get to the tragedies, they will definitely be tragic plays. And one of the things about Macbeth is that this is Shakespeare's shortest play. Not a bad place to be at this point in the semester, to work with his shortest play, since we are nearing the end and might not necessarily have as much time as we did at the beginning of the semester. This play has been known as the cursed play because there's all kinds of superstition and folklore associated with it, of terrible events occurring, either when it's been produced or when ultimately individuals even utter its name. So it's been either called the cursed play or the M play. So in theater lore, you don't say the word Macbeth. There's lots of dark atmosphere here. It's definitely very Gothic in many respects. As you know, I'm a fan of the Gothic, so oftentimes students will ask me, what is your favorite play from Shakespeare? And that's a difficult question to answer. More often than not, it's the play that I happen to be reading and discussing at the time. But I guess if I had to pinpoint one particular play, it would probably be Macbeth, just because it is so incredibly Gothic. And we get strong women, which is something that we didn't necessarily see in Richard, but we also see evil women. So what that does or doesn't say about female is something that we can talk about over the course of the next several classes. Now, interestingly, this play was performed for not Queen Elizabeth. By this point, she had passed, and the new monarch was in place, King James from Scotland. And it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that King James, while he didn't mind plays, he wasn't necessarily as much of a fan as Queen Elizabeth was. One of the issues he had with plays is that he thought they were too long. So having Shakespeare write his shortest play when King James is in power seems to be a typical Shakespearean move in trying to flatter or at least win the favor of the monarch. Also, King James is very interested in the supernatural, and Macbeth is known for the supernatural, specifically the three witches, which we will discuss next class as well. Again, it doesn't seem coincidental that Shakespeare would be trying to find a way to have King James be, if not as supportive, at least somewhat supportive of Shakespeare's works as Queen Elizabeth. So I'm hopeful that at this point in the semester you have read Richard II in its entirety. The good news about the BBC production that we viewed is that it is almost word for word the same as Shakespeare's play. So by watching the production and reading the play, you basically are going to get a kind of mirror effect. So that said, a production is never a substitute for reading, just like reading is never a substitute for watching a production. But since Richard is a notoriously complex play, I wanted to make sure that you were getting a production that was as faithful to the original as possible. When we get to Macbeth, we don't necessarily have to do that, though the BBC has basically made all of Shakespeare's plays available in this format. So if you ever wanted to get the most accurate version that you could find of a Shakespearean play, I would recommend the BBC. But when it comes to Macbeth, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Royal Shakespeare Company, which is where we will be headed. But before we get into Macbeth, hopefully, again, you have finished Richard II and you are beginning to read Macbeth. Though, of course, we will talk about production before we talk about the play itself. So, again, for your attendance question, to identify one of the quotes that I've identified and to talk about its importance, or to identify a quote that I did not mention and talk about its importance. So, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and you should be receiving your papers shortly if you haven't already. And we will continue on next class talking about the cursed play, Macbeth. Take care. Bye bye.